good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Ottawa Green Business Virtual Speaker Series with Michael Shank. For those of you who don't know us, quick introduction to Envirocenter. We're a nonprofit environmental organization based here in Ottawa. Our core mission supports sustainable lifestyles, which means that we encourage people to take action on climate in their own lives, in their homes, their workplaces and businesses, their communities, and of course, right here in our city. By pointing folks toward practical ways to reduce their environmental impact, we help them make lasting, positive change. Our work focuses on 4 key areas: green homes, green transportation, green business, and green lifestyle. Today, of course, we're here to talk about green business. So Envirocenter's Ottawa Green Business Program support businesses and other workplace organizations in working together to achieve our collective sustainability goals. The Ottawa Green Business Hub, formerly known as Carbon 613, helps local businesses achieve their sustainability goals by sharing knowledge, resources, and tools for tracking greenhouse gas emissions and setting a reduction target. The Ottawa Green Business Hub is part of a national network of Green Economy Canada hubs with more than 275 member businesses across Ontario and new hubs and partner programs growing across the country, so we can tap into broad support without losing our local focus. Our virtual speaker and tour series will host guests who cover a variety of topics related to business sustainability, and you can find more information at www.ottawagreenbusiness.ca. To stay up to date, please sign up for our newsletter. We'll be posting a link in the chat, as well as a link to the websites and some more content about Michael. But I would like to give a few logistical notes before I introduce today's speaker. Please note that the session is currently being recorded and will be shared online after the event. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation portion so that everyone is able to hear Michael speaking, unless you have a question for Michael, in which case feel free to unmute yourself as time allows. And we'll also be monitoring for questions in the chat box. So please type them there if you've got one burning a hole in your brain and you don't want to interrupt right away. And we'll bring them forward to Michael either when there's a gap or at the end for a question and answer period. So with that, I'll introduce Michael here. Michael's professional career includes leading press and/or policy shops at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Climate Nexus. Clients included the United Nations, Vatican City, the White House, and Fortune 500 companies. Also US Congress, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Institute for Economics and Peace, Biodiversity Northwest, and Puget Soundkeeper Alliance, and more. Michael's academic career includes a PhD from George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and is focused on climate conflict. Michael is adjunct faculty at New York University's Center for Global Affairs, where he teaches graduate courses on sustainable development, power and politics, and climate and security. Once again, welcome to everyone in the audience joining us today. Welcome to Michael, and Michael, you have the digital floor.
I have the digital floor. Greetings, everyone. Evan, thank you so much for that introduction, and a big thanks to Envirocenter for reaching out and inviting me to be with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen and jump into it. And let me just move all your faces over here. All right, here we go. So this is me, Michael Shank. I work for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and I know some of you just joined, so you won't have seen the link I put in chat, but it's carbonneutralcities.org. And I'm going to talk about what our global cities are doing. I represent and I work with and work for the most ambitious climate actors out there. And I know the city of Ottawa has some ambitious targets too: 100% GHG reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050 for the community, 100% for city operations by 2040, which is awesome. So the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance is 24 cities globally that represent the vanguard in targets and timelines that are really aggressive and really ambitious in terms of reducing emissions, switching to renewables, ramping down waste to zero waste, transitioning to regenerative economies, regenerative ag, and fill in the blank. Our cities are on the cutting edge of all things, including circular economy. And so what I'm going to do with all of you today is show what's happening in our cities, and a lot of it has huge business implications, huge industry implications, and couple that with not just a policy deep dive in terms of what our cities are leading on, but also a behavior change deep dive. And by that I mean none of this is going to be possible unless we win the hearts and minds of the public, the policymaking community, and the private sector. So how do we build public will, political will, private sector will for this work to get done? Because we know what the solutions are. When I teach at NYU, I teach a sustainable development course there. I say to the students, listen, we know for the most part what the problems are. We know for the most part what the solutions are. The real work now is building the public will, political will, and private sector will to get the work done quickly. We have we have to have 50% reduction, our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We have to have them by 2030 if we want to be on a sustainable course. So I think a lot about sustainable cities. Reason I'm working with cities versus the US Congress, I worked in the US Congress for many years. I worked with the UN for many years when they rolled out their sustainable development goals. Reason why I like working with cities, multiple reasons. One, that's where most of the emissions are. That's where most of the energy use is. That's where most of the world's population is. And that's where most of the climate impacts are occurring, especially in coastal cities. And so when you think about it from a climate change perspective, this is where the work needs to be done. The added bonus of working with cities at the city level is that you have a closer relationship with the community, the constituency, and most people know their mayor, their city council versus state or national governments where they may not know their state leadership or national leadership quite with the intimacy that they might know their mayor or their city council. So you can get work done quickly at the city level, especially when national governments like my own recently with the last administration wasn't acting at all on climate. The new administration is going to act a little more quickly, which is good. But especially when national governments aren't acting, cities play a pivotal role in leading the work and then sending the signal to the market, to the business community. Some of you are on this call. This is where the work is needed. This is what we need to scale up. This is the technology that we need to roll out ASAP. So I'm going to tick through a lot of the leading game-changing work in our cities, and then again, couple it with basically how do we sell this work? How do we make it appealing to the private sector, to the public, to the political apparatus in city X, Y, or Z, so that we are rolling out this stuff immediately, because we have to. All right, let's jump in. First thing, and Vancouver, BC has been a leader in this space. Basically, it's zero carbon, zero emission buildings. And the city of Vancouver rolled out a zero emissions building code years ago and led across CNCA. That's my organization, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. I'll just say CNCA for short, so it's easier. Led within our network this early, which requires all new buildings to be zero emissions. Now, what does that mean? This is what it means. Take a look. Everything from producing renewable energy on site, if you can, whether it's solar up above or geothermal, lowering emissions, making the building super efficient, making sure the envelope is super tight, but also take a look at the third block down, embodied carbon. So we're moving into this space pretty quickly. European cities are leading on it, but soon we'll come to North America and work with a lot of North American cities on embodied carbon. What is embodied carbon? Well, it's all the carbon that goes into the making of the building. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but when you think about messaging zero carbon buildings, like if I walk on the street in Ottawa and I roll up to someone and be like, hey, do you know what a zero carbon building is? They may not know. So how do we message this work? How do we talk about things like embodied carbon or energy efficiency or renewable energy on site or even peak energy demand? How do we sell this? Well, New York City did this. And what I like about what New York City is doing here is that they're messaging to consumers, hey, when you roll into this building, when you walk into this building, whether you're working there or living there, this is your energy efficiency rating, A, B, C, D, E. We know it intuitively because we have a grading system. This is what New York City also does with its restaurants. It will grade its restaurants. When you go into a restaurant, there'll be an A on it, or a B, or a C, or a D, and you know how clean it is as a result. Well, they mirrored that with their buildings, which I love, which is, how do we communicate this work to the public, to the policymaking community, to the private sector in ready terms so they can understand it immediately and have quick access to it? And so they're grading their buildings based on their energy efficiency. So the public's like, oh, okay, this building is efficient or it's not efficient. Another thing we need to do with zero emission buildings is make them beautiful. People will switch if quality of life is better, if things are more beautiful, if they enjoy it more, if it appeals to their ego or id or other. So this is a zero emission building as an example. This is gorgeous. I would love to work here because of how beautiful it is, how green it is, the solar, the design, the aesthetics, the feng shui. All of that needs to be an important part of how we sell zero emission carbon buildings, zero carbon buildings, zero emission building codes, because that language isn't going to land with the public. Another game changer. Making sure that we've got charging infrastructure all across our cities. Some cities do this better than others. Oslo is one of our members, Norway, and well over 50% of all new cars in Oslo are EVs. And it's so easy to navigate Oslo and the outer regions in Norway with your EV because the charging infrastructure has been developed. I live in Vermont. I have an animal sanctuary that way, which you can't see. It's a big farm. And I have an EV. I have a Nissan Leaf. And there are parts of Vermont I can't go because my Leaf is older. It's like 2015. And so it's a 100-mile range. And there are parts of Vermont that, because of the mountains, I just can't access because our infrastructure isn't built yet. So this is essential for cities and states and regions. And some cities are doing a great job of this. I mean, even places, China's really leading on. This is Shenzhen, and their bus fleet, their taxi fleet is all electric. They are building electric buses by the tens of thousands every year and shipping them globally. And this is where we need to head as cities so that it's super easy to do. Because again, think about the public will, political will, private sector will. People are more likely to switch if it's easy, if it's accessible. Because if we get them enticed, if we get them excited, like, hey, why don't you switch from your fossil fuel car, your internal combustion car to an EV? We have to make it easy, because if we don't, if it's too tough, if it's too expensive, it's too tedious, and they can't charge, or they have that range anxiety and don't land where they want to land, they may not do it again. We may have lost that opportunity for behavior change. Another game changer for our cities is the zero waste agenda. Some cities like Amsterdam are looking at circular economy, so they're going above and beyond just zero waste. San Francisco is our leader here. They divert 85% of waste from the landfill. It never ends up in the landfill. And if you look at, again, thinking about public will, making behavior change easy, they've made it easy because they give these cartons, they've labeled them by color so you know exactly what goes where. They tried to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing. And as a result, did. I mean, look at their diversion rate. This was a couple of years ago, this 80% chart, but leading around the globe, and certainly in the United States, in terms of diversion and making use of that for composting soil, et cetera. Another game changer is electrifying buildings. Now, a lot of cities, their biggest carbon footprint are buildings. New York City, as an example, 1 million buildings in New York City. And a lot of those buildings are heated by oil or gas predominantly. And we have to electrify all those buildings. Now, do we do it for environmental reasons? Of course. But do we sell it on environmental reasons? Are people going to change? Are they going to electrify their buildings, which is a lot of work? I've electrified mine. I have heat pumps right over there, solar out in my field, and Tesla Powerwall batteries in my garage. But are people going to electrify just because it's the right thing to do for the climate, for moral reasons, ethical reasons, normative reasons? No. And so I lift this up here. See these incentives. It's more comfortable, less maintenance, safer. Think of security, safer in society, et cetera, safer, emissions free, and it's cheaper. So when we think of incentivizing people to do the right thing in the industry, and I know so many contractors who have yet to get this messaging right. And so if someone's advising a homeowner or a business, like, hey, we can electrify your building, we can get heat pumps, we can get some renewables on the roof, whatever. How do they sell it in such a way that they're appealing to people's economic needs, health needs, security needs, quality of life needs? And I haven't, in Vermont, just as my example here, haven't seen contractors in the industry yet get this messaging right, so that people are like, oh yeah, no, this, I should do this. You're right, I should do this. But we've got to do it. And so we need the messaging right to, again, win the hearts and minds on this. Life is better. I mean, if you think, again, of selling this as a package and the energy independence that comes from it. I live in rural Vermont where we get power outages all the time, which is why I made my home energy secure. So when the next power outage comes, which it will, I have power. And I've had neighbors come over to my house for a hot shower. And then we get into a conversation. They're like, well, how do you have power? You know, I talk about my solar, I talk about my heat pumps, talk about my Tesla Powerwall batteries. There are incentives here. It's quality of life. And how do we sell this? Another game changer. A lot of cities are rolling out either congestion fees, low emission zones, like low emission vehicle zones, where they price cars that want to come into those zones. And if you're low emission or high occupancy, then pay less or pay nothing. But if you are single occupancy and you're driving in a fossil fuel burner, then you pay more. And this is a way of keeping some of the particulates out of downtowns because they're deadly and they're killing people prematurely. But this is a direction a lot of cities are moving, which is great, including some renderings for car-free cities entirely, which I would love to live in. How great would this be? COVID has also enabled us to carve out places in cities to make them pedestrian friendly or bike friendly. And one approach is to paint the intersection as a way of identifying this is meant to be pedestrian safe or pedestrian friendly, so that cars driving up slow down. They've discovered through research and data to back this up, that when you paint an intersection, it definitely slows traffic down, and there's a lot less pedestrian casualty or injury as a result. Another thing some of our cities are doing is they're seizing this COVID moment to shut down streets, turn them permanently into parks. But what they'll say often to the public is that this is a temporary, we're going to test this out. We're going to shut down this street for a couple months and we'll see what it's like. You get a chance to use it. We'll have restaurants, we'll have music, we'll have festivals. And what they'll do, mindful of behavior change, because if people are told that this is shut down permanently and no longer can you drive through, especially in the United States, people don't want their freedoms taken away. They're like, don't ban this, don't take away my freedoms. Versus a temporary test. We're going to shut down this street, we're going to turn it into a park just for a couple of months. We're just going to test it out. Then what happens is people get attached to it. And once they get attached to it, they don't want to lose it. They're risk averse, we're loss averse. And so if you get attachment, if you build that attachment, it's much easier to keep it permanent after the test pilot versus the other way around. So it's just a little strategy tip there. Another game changer is building renewable energy within downtown cores or right outside downtown, so that it's easier transmission, fewer transmission lines, and that you're building this kind of energy security, energy reliance within a downtown center. This is, I believe this is Boulder. What we're seeing with our cities, Boulder is one of our members, is that they are trying to build as much renewable in the city as possible. Yokohama, as an example, has built this virtual, they're one of our members, has built this virtual power plant across the city by putting solar on roofs and then batteries in those same locations. So schools, hospitals, all of it has both solar and batteries, so that when the next storm comes, fill in the blank, and it does devastation to the regional grid, the city isn't hit as a result because they've got their local renewables, they've got their local backup batteries, etc. And again, the advantages here in terms of resilience and independence are huge. Another game changer is the idea of a climate budget. And Oslo has rolled this out for several years now, and Sydney and some of our other cities are doing this too, which is this. Every department in a city gets allocated a certain amount of carbon that they can emit in a year. So whether it's Department of Labor, Department of Education, Department of Parks, Department of Transportation, you name the department in Oslo, and they've got an allotted or an allocated amount of carbon they can use with their activities. And so it forces everyone to think about climate in all of their activities and forces the city to synchronistically work towards emissions reduction in a really efficient way. And so we're hoping all our cities roll this out soon. I've already mentioned this, but here's the game changer in terms of embodied carbon. Embodied carbon makes up a huge carbon footprint. We don't often think about it. We haven't often thought about it. And so this is the new frontier for our cities. Again, our European cities are rolling this out in terms of reducing emissions related to embodied carbon. But this is it. I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk through what it is. You can imagine in all stages, phases of building construction, there is carbon being utilized, burned, extracted, etc. And so how do we make sure every bit of this supply chain, just like we think about fashion or food and that supply chain, which we've done a better job of, but we haven't really done with buildings, is as carbon light as possible. And again, selling the benefits of embodied carbon and carbon light construction, how is life going to be better working or living in one of these spots? We know it. I mean, it's beautiful. I would love to live here. Finally, our cities are looking at climate equity, climate justice, racial justice, and it's been too long. We haven't historically prioritized this, but we need to. And thankfully, some of our cities are leading on this. Why? Because, well, we stuck fossil fuel facilities in under-resourced communities, underserved communities, disadvantaged communities. I'm using some of the words that different cities and states have used. Certainly communities of color and low-income communities. And so it has harmed them. It has killed them. They are disproportionately impacted and affected by our fossil fuel placement in their communities and their exposure to those particulates. So there are many things that need to be done on this front. One of the things is, of course, greening cities, because at least in the United States, the richer communities in a city have lots of trees. The poorer communities in a city have fewer trees. It's much more of a concrete jungle, which is problematic from a health perspective, but also from a heat island perspective. And so just mere rolling out tree planting agendas across cities is going to be essential first step in terms of mitigating some of those emissions and health impacts, but more work beyond that in terms of greening roofs and more. Something else that we're thinking about, certainly in the United States, but Canada would be included here, and this concept of climate reparations is becoming more discussed, which is good. At any climate talk at the UN level, there has been rows over conflicts over the rich worlds, the OECD countries that have industrialized and have emitted all the carbon that's in the air predominantly, because in their industrialization over the last 100 years, they are responsible for the archived and current emissions. And so underdeveloped countries, or least developed countries, are saying, well, it's our turn. We get to industrialize, so we get to do the same emitting. And then these rich countries in the OECD are saying, no. Actually, if you could do it in a green way, that'd be great. And least developed countries are like, hold on, you got to pollute, we get to pollute too. So there's this idea of, well, given that the United States and other wealthier countries have emitted most of the emissions in the air, how do we make sure that we're repairing the harm done? And countries that are being impacted by climate impacts, like Bangladesh, for example, deserve the US, America's attention, because we are responsible for the climate impacts that they are reeling from. So not only how do we help them leapfrog the dirty fuels to cleaner fuels, but also how do we help them adapt and be resilient in the face of devastating climate. I've done some work in Bangladesh, and what the communities there are facing is very, very scary. And they're migrating. There are a lot of climate refugees now because people are no longer safe in their homes. So this is another frontier that we're thinking about. When I think of the cities that are being resilient in the face of sea level rise, New York City is thinking about this. All coastal cities are thinking about this with sea level rise. But again, when we think about selling this work to the public or to the private sector, how do we make it beautiful to create these buffers? So the next time, this is Philadelphia, the next time sea levels rise or flooding happens or hurricanes happen, we've got some buffers in here so that people are safe and business isn't destroyed as a result. So it's really making it beautiful while doing good work, not just building the wall thinking the water will stay out. No, it's really building up more porous, greener spaces around cities and making it beautiful while doing so. So let me just check on time here, 2:23, great. I want to cover one more thing very quickly. So those were all the policy game changers that our cities are leading on. And I want to transition here very quickly, and I'll tick through these. In terms of how do we then enable behavior change? If you look on the right, I've already mentioned core motivators. I talked about economic, health, security, quality of life. If we get the motivation right, and it's not always environmental, it's not always ethical, it's not always for the next generation, what's going to appeal to most people, especially in struggling times around COVID, oftentimes is basic human needs. The simplicity work, well, that's the job of the city. That's the job of the private sector, to make it easy for people to do the right thing. So the simplicity factors are really on the industry and public sector to make the lift easy. And then these triggers, the facilitation, the spark, the signal, that's where communications comes in. And why it's so important that once we've got the action teed up, whether it's an EV, zero emission building, electrifying building, you name it, thanks to industry and public sector coming together, how do we tee up the facilitated moment so that people see something and want to do something? And I'm just going to tick through very quickly, and then we'll get into some Q&A. These are the things that get in the way of behavior change. These are either opportunities or obstacles, and I'm going to explore them very quickly. Choice overload. In the environmental space, we have so much to do, and people can feel overwhelmed, paralyzed by it. New York City, when they wanted people to switch off single-use plastics and switch to reusables, they built one website to spread the word, to campaign bringit.nyc. And it was about bringing your reusable. And that was the whole campaign. Mindful of choice overload, like, oh, there's so much I can do. New York was like, here's one thing you can do. And this is how to do it. And they built a website just for that. Loved it. Cognitive depletion. When we try to win the hearts and minds, people can be exhausted. Maybe they're under-resourced. They've been working 2 jobs. They have several kids. COVID has exhausted them. Mental health is frustrated because of COVID. Yokohama brought people together. This was a whole energy campaign they built using no energy whatsoever. It was a partnership with Starbucks. And they brought people in. This is the city of Yokohama, partnering with Starbucks. Bring people in, feed them, music. This was pre-COVID. Have a good time, nourish the community, and then sell them on the idea that nothing is charming. By nothing, they meant no energy use, low energy use, light energy use is charming. Hassle factors. People aren't going to do it if it's hassle full. If it's hassle free, they might. Helsinki, love this. Look at this. So these are suctioned into a centralized system, paper, waste, compost, glass. They make it super easy all across Helsinki. They're one of our members, to just throw it away rather than throw it on the street or throw it in a trash bin. Nope. You put it in here, it gets suctioned into the main central frame. And so how do we make this work easy for people to do the right thing? Because people ultimately aren't going to go out of their way. They prefer status quo bias. They're not going to go out of their way. So how do we make it easy? They also built this whole app. Like, you want to be green in Helsinki? Here's how to do it. I'd be curious if the city of Ottawa has something similar. They found this to be very effective in changing behavior. Identity, we know that different identities come to the table, and it's our job to build a new identity, sometimes for a community that might be fractured or polemically, politically divided. And what Vancouver did is tap into this idea of pride, that we have Vancouver Pride. We're going to be the greenest city. They launched this years ago, but we're going to be the greenest city in the world. And they've doubled down on this narrative. And every year they build out this narrative to really build pride in Vancouver. Limited attention. We know people are distracted by the myriad devices and distractions in their life. This is San Francisco's website, sfrecycles.org. So if you go to this website, look at all the negative space, look at all the white space, so that your eyes as a user are attracted to the action they want you to focus on. I love this. So as we think about engaging the public or the policymaking community or the private sector, how do we make it as easy as possible to navigate? Not too much text, a lot of visuals, and a lot of white space, negative space, so that people are attracted to the action we want them to take. I've already mentioned this already. We hate loss. We're more inclined to avoid loss than the pleasure we get from gain. You know, a $100 bill, if I were to give you a $100 bill versus you losing one, the emotional response in you is greater in the loss than in the gain. And so what Oslo did, one of our members, this is their climate page, this is their climate site. They're trying to build attachment to that which they don't want to lose. So they're like, hey, we know you love swimming here. So they're building attachment. And then their hope is that their community is so attached to these swimming holes that then they want to protect them, don't want to lose them from either climate impacts or phosphate nitrate impacts, etc. Primacy bias, we know that people are attracted to that which we lead with first. See the yellow bird? Again, Helsinki took their app and they just put it in people's faces. This is a well-trafficked area in Helsinki where I've been, and I got this picture from one city staff. They're putting it in their face. So when we think about changing behavior, winning the hearts and minds, building the public and political will, we have to bring this stuff to the fore. And in the climate space, I haven't seen enough of this, like really pushing in people's faces so that they see it, are attracted by it, mindful of primacy bias. Procrastination, we know we all procrastinate. One thing Boulder did is created little videos, 1 to 2 minute videos for all these actions of citizens taking these actions so that it would seem super simple, which it relatively is, but a lot of people think of electrifying their heating and cooling, being like, whoa, that's too tedious. I don't want to get heat pumps. I don't know how it works. I've got my oil, I've got my gas. Don't talk to me about electric. But they created these videos just like, no, it's simple. You can do this too. And so that's a campaign, a comms campaign, again, to convey to people like, listen, I know you're going to procrastinate on this because it might feel tedious or cumbersome or burdensome. It's easy to do. London did something similar in giving people variations on a theme. So, hey, citizen X, Y, or Z, you might be super busy. Well, if you've got 5 minutes, click this. If you've got an hour, click this. If you've got a day, click this. So giving people different ways to engage is also a way to kind of counter some of the procrastination we might see. Social norms, we know social norming works in changing behavior. This is Sydney in their Better Buildings Cup. So this was a competition to green your building, your business building. And look at what they did. They named the people and they named the company. And they laud them. They give them points. They give them trophies. They give them promotion. This was all mindful of social norming, that people are more likely to compete if they know their colleagues who are competing in the same space. So how do we capture social norming potential, again, to change behaviors? I've mentioned this already, status quo bias. We like to stay in the same lane. We don't like to change lanes. So what City of Portland, Oregon did, see this language here, save more, live more. When people think of climate work or energy work, environmental work, it can feel overwhelming. Like, how are we going to have emissions by 2030? Well, what Portland is doing here is they're saying, you know what, you can stay in your lane. You don't have to change your lane radically. Just save a little bit more, live a little bit more. Think of those messages I said earlier: economics, health, security, quality of life, id, ego. This is what they're tapping in to, but they're also saying, hey, you don't have to change your lane radically. Two more I want to lift up. Availability heuristic. This is your ability to remember in your Rolodex what has happened. So when people think of climate impacts or climate solutions, unless they've been told them, unless they've been covered in the news, and I don't know what Ottawa's news is like. I know certainly some of the national news agencies and how they cover climate. But unless people have like a reference point, they may not think climate is impacting their lives, and they may not know of solutions in the climate space. So what the city of Amsterdam, one of our members, did is they created this whole new community platform to show all the solutions in the city space, so that if a resident of Amsterdam is like, oh, what are people doing? I feel alone. I'm not part of a movement. What can I do? Where's my agency? How do I get involved? They wanted to reflect back, look, here's all the movement that's happening in the community. You aren't alone. You are part of a movement, and that their availability heuristic, their way of knowing, had a reference point here. Lastly, planning fallacy. Certainly we think it's going to be an easy start to finish. Of course, it never is. And I just want to draw your attention to just a half hour right in the middle. So this is a brochure that Helsinki, and an online platform that Helsinki launched for its residents. And what I like about this whole just a half hour bit is that they were giving people who might be stuck in the planning fallacy because their start to finish became long and tedious. They're like, hey, you can fit this in to your planning pretty easily. It's just 30 minutes, and getting people to switch behaviors by these little bite-sized chunks, mindful of their unplanned days and how it became, the before becomes the after. They're just like, here, just try this little bite-sized chunk. So this is some of the way our cities are mindful of behavior obstacles and trying to win the hearts and minds.
It's been a really great presentation, really informative for our members and the other guests joining us today. So
great to meet you. Thanks, everyone.
Without any further questions, I'll just give a quick outro, and then we can all get back to our afternoons. Thanks again very much, Michael, for joining us today and sharing all your insights here. Thanks as well to all of our attendees who are on the call, and those of you joining us from the future. If you're watching this as a recording, thanks. You took the time to join us today, whenever today is, and learn some things that you can bring back to your own workplaces and businesses, and keep pushing the envelope on business sustainability in Ottawa, across Canada, and around the world. And thanks also to my colleague Mandy, who's been working background tech support this whole time, monitoring the chat for us, posting links. Always great to have her on, supporting us there. And don't forget to sign up for the Ottawa Green Business newsletter. If you haven't done that already, it's the best way to stay informed about events like this one, speakers like Michael, other virtual tours and things that we have going on this year with Ottawa Green Business. Mandy has posted some links in the chat. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.